Ahoy! I hope you're enjoying these readings of Kurt Vonnegut's work. This is just a reminder that I have 3 audiobooks available on Audible from the hilarious author Frank J. Edler. Death Gets a Book is about the kind of job training you might expect if you inadvertently become a Grim Reaper. Most jobs suck, but being a death can be a job worse than, well, death. A Death in Toledo follows a rather unique Reaper with a serious work problem. Vampires. How do you claim the souls of beings that aren't quite dead? And finally, Catcoin, the fictional history of a cryptocurrency. It's about a digital currency based on cats. Literal cats. And told from the perspective of the very first Catcoin, One, an adorably fluffy kitty with a serious wine-drinking problem. You can find samples of these audiobooks scattered around this channel. And remember to like, subscribe, and comment. More Vonnegut is yet to come. Thanks, and enjoy Part 5 of Galapagos. Galapagos by Kurt Vonnegut. Part 5. Book 1, Chapters 32 through 38. Read by Ron Gabaldon. 32. Just as everybody got nicely settled in the bus in front of the El Dorado, the news came over several radios in the crowd that the nature cruise of the century had been canceled. That meant to the crowd, and to the soldiers too, who were just civilians in soldier suits, that the food in the hotel now belonged to everyone. Take it from somebody who has been around for 1,000,000 years. When you get right down to it, food is practically the whole story every time. Quoth Mandarax. First comes fodder, then comes morality. Bertolt Brecht, 1898 to 1956. So there was a rush for the hotel's entrances which momentarily engulfed the bus. Although the bus and the people in it were of no interest to the food rioters, they banged on the sides of the bus, however, and yelled, agonized by the realization that others were already inside the hotel, and that there would be no food left for them. It was certainly very frightening to be on the bus. It might be turned over. It might be set on fire. Rocks might be thrown, making shrapnel of the window glass. The place for survivors was to be on the floor in the aisle. Hisako Hiraguchi performed her first intimate act with blind Selena, instructing her with her hands and murmured Japanese to kneel in the aisle with her head down. Then Hisako knelt beside her and Kazakh and put her arm across her back. How tenderly Hisako and Selena would care for each other during the coming years! What a beautiful and sweet-natured child they would rear! How I admired them! Yes, and James Waite found himself posing yet again as a protector of children. He was sheltering with his own body the terrified Kankabono girls in the aisle. He had meant only to save himself if he could, but Mary Hepburn had grabbed both his hands and pulled him toward her so that they formed a living fort. If there was to be flying glass, it would bite into them and not into the little girls. Quoth Mandarax. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. St. John, 4 B.C. to 30? It was while Waite was in this position that his heart began to fibrillate, which is to say that its fibers began to twitch in an uncoordinated manner, so that the march of blood in his circulatory system was no longer orderly. Here, heredity was operating again. He had no way of knowing this, but Waite's father and mother, who were also father and daughter, were both then dead of heart attacks which had struck when they were in their early 40s. It was a lucky thing for humanity that Waite did not live long enough to take part in the Santa Rosalia mating games. Then again, it might not have made all that much difference if people today had inherited his time bomb heart, since nobody would have lived long enough for the bomb to go off anyway. Anybody Waite's age today would be a regular Methuselah. Down at the waterfront, meanwhile, another mob, another fibrillating organ in the social system of Ecuador, was stripping the Bahia de Darwin not only of its food, but of its television sets and telephones and radar and sonar and radios and light bulbs and compasses and toilet paper and carpeting and soap and pots and pans and charts and mattresses and outboard motors and inflatable landing craft and on and on. These survivors would even try to steal the winch which lowered or raised the anchors, but succeeded only in damaging it beyond repair. At least they left the lifeboats, but bereft of their emergency food supplies. And Captain von Kleist, in fear of his life, had been driven up into the crow's nest, clad only in his underwear. The crowd at the El Dorado swept past the bus like a tidal wave, leaving it high and dry, so to speak. It was free to go where it pleased. There was nobody much around except for a few people lying down here and there, injured or killed in the rush. So Siegfried von Kleist, heroically suppressing the spasms and ignoring the hallucinations symptomatic of Huntington's chorea, took his place in the driver's seat. He thought it best that his 10 passengers stay in the aisle where they were, invisible from the outside and calming one another with body heat. He started the engine and saw that he had a full tank of gasoline. He turned on the air conditioning. He announced in English, the only language he had in common with any of the passengers, that it would be very cool inside in a minute or two. This was a promise he could keep. It was twilight outside now, so he turned on his parking lights. It was about that time that Peru declared war on Ecuador. 2 of Peru's fighter bombers were then over Ecuadorian territories, one with its rocket tuned to the radar signals coming from Guayaquil International Airport, and the other with its rocket tuned to radar signals coming from the naval base on the Galapagos island of Baltra, lair of a sail training ship, 6 Coast Guard ships, 2 ocean-going tugs, a patrol submarine, a dry dock, and, high and dry in the dry dock, a destroyer. The destroyer was the largest ship in the Ecuadorian Navy, save for one, the Bahia de Darwin. Quoth Mandarax, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way." Charles Dickens, 1812 to 1870. 33. I sometimes speculate as to what humanity might have become if the first settlers on Santa Rosalia had been the original passenger list and crew for the nature cruise of the century. Captain von Kleist, surely, and Hisako Hiraguchi and Selina McIntosh and Mary Hepburn, and, instead of the Kankabono girls, the sailors and officers and Jacqueline Onassis and Dr. Henry Kissinger and Rudolf Nureyev and Mick Jagger and Paloma Picasso and Walter Cronkite and Bobby King and Robert Pepin, the greatest chef in France, and of course Andrew McIntosh and Zenji Hiraguchi, and on and on. The island could have supported that many individuals, just barely. There would have been some struggles, some fights, I guess, some killings even, if food or water ran short, and I suppose some of them would have imagined that nature or something was very pleased if they emerged victorious. But their survival wouldn't have amounted to a hill of beans, as far as evolution was concerned, if they didn't reproduce. And most of the women on the passenger list were past childbearing age, and so not worth fighting for. During the first 13 years on Santa Rosalia, before Akiko reached puberty in fact, the only fertile women would have been Selina, who was blind, and Hisako Hiraguchi, who had already given birth to a baby all covered with fur, and 3 others who were normal. And probably all of them would have been impregnated by victors, even against their will. But in the long run, I don't think it would have made much difference which males did the impregnating. Mick Jagger or Henry Kissinger or the captain or the cabin boy. Humanity would still be pretty much what it is today. In the long run, the survivors would still have been not the most ferocious strugglers, but the most efficient fisherfolk. That's how things work in the islands here. There were live Maine lobsters who also came within a hair of having their survival skills tested by the Galapagos archipelago. Before the Bahia de Darwin was looted, there were 200 of them in aerated tanks of salt water in the hold. The waters around Santa Rosalia were surely cold enough for them, but perhaps too deep. There was this about them at any rate. They were like human beings in that they could eat almost anything if they had to. And Captain von Kleist, when he was an old man, remembered those lobsters in their tanks. The older he became, the more vivid were his recollections of events of the long ago. And after supper one night, he amused Akiko, the furry daughter of Hisako Hiraguchi, with a science fiction fantasy whose premise was that the Maine lobsters had made it to the islands, and that 1,000,000 years had passed, as they have indeed passed now, and that the lobsters had become the dominant species on the planet, and had built cities and theaters and hospitals and public transportation and so on. He had lobsters playing violins and solving murders and performing microsurgery and subscribing to book clubs and so on. The moral of the story was that the lobsters were doing exactly what human beings had done, which was to make a mess of everything. They all wished that they could just be ordinary lobsters, particularly since there were no human beings around who wanted to boil them alive. That was all they had had to complain about in the first place. Being boiled alive. Now, just because they hadn't wanted to be boiled alive anymore, they had to support symphony orchestras and on and on. The viewpoint character in the captain's story was the underpaid second-chair French horn player in the Lobsterville Symphony Orchestra, who had just lost his wife to a professional ice hockey player. When he made up that story, he had no idea that humanity elsewhere was on the verge of extinction, and that other life forms were facing less and less opposition, in case they had a tendency to become dominant. The captain would never hear about that, and neither would anybody else on Santa Rosalia. And I am speaking only of the dominance of large life forms over other large life forms. Truth be told, the planet's most victorious organisms have always been microscopic. In all the encounters between Davids and Goliaths, was there ever a time when a Goliath won? On the level of the big creatures, then, the visible strugglers, lobsters were surely poor candidates for becoming as elaborately constructive and destructive as humankind. If the captain had told his mordant fable about octopi instead of lobsters, though, it might not have been quite so ridiculous. Back then, as now, those squishy creatures had highly developed brains, whose basic function was to control their versatile arms. Their situation, one might think, wasn't all that different from that of human beings, with hands to control. Presumably, their brains could do other things with their arms and brains than catch fish. But I have yet to see an octopus, or any sort of animal for that matter, which wasn't entirely content to pass its time on Earth as a food gatherer, to shun the experiments with unlimited greed and ambition performed by humankind. As for human beings making a comeback, of starting to use tools and build houses and play musical instruments and so on again, they would have to do it with their beaks this time. Their arms have become flippers, in which the hand bones are almost entirely imprisoned and immobilized. Each flipper is studded with 5 purely ornamental nubbins, attractive to members of the opposite sex at mating time. These are, in fact, the tips of 4 suppressed fingers and a thumb. Those parts of people's brains which used to control their hands, moreover, simply don't exist anymore, and human skulls are now much more streamlined on that account. The more streamlined the skull, the more successful the fisher person. If people can swim as fast and far as fur seals now, what is to prevent their swimming all the way back to the mainland, whence their ancestors came? Answer: nothing. Plenty have tried it, or will try it during periods of fish shortages or overpopulation, but the bacterium which eats human eggs is always there to greet them. So much for exploration. Then again, it is so peaceful here. Why would anybody want to live on the mainland? Every island has become an ideal place to raise children, with waving coconut palms and broad white beaches and limpid blue lagoons. And all of the people are so innocent and relaxed now, all because evolution took their hands away. Quoth Mandarax, "In works of labor or of skill, I would be busy too, for Satan finds some mischief still for idle hands to do." Isaac Watts, 1674 to 1748. 34. There was this Peruvian pilot a million years ago, a young lieutenant colonel who had his fighter bomber skipping from wisp to wisp of finely divided matter at the very edge of the planet's atmosphere. His name was Guillermo Reyes, and he was able to survive at such an altitude because his suit and helmet were inflated with an artificial atmosphere. People used to be so marvelous, making impossible dreams they made come true. Colonel Reyes had had an inconclusive discussion with a fellow airman one time as to whether anything felt better than sexual intercourse. He was in contact on his radio now with that same comrade, who was back at the airbase in Peru, and who was to tell him when Peru was officially at war with Ecuador. Colonel Reyes had already activated the brain of the tremendous self-propelled weapon slung underneath his airplane. That was its first taste of life. But already it was madly in love with the radar dish atop the control tower at Guayaquil International Airport, a legitimate military target since Ecuador kept 10 of its own warplanes there. This amazing radar lover under the colonel's plane was like the great land tortoises of the Galapagos Islands to this extent. It had all the nourishment it needed inside its shell. So the word came that it was all right for him to let the thing go. So he let the thing go. His friend on the ground asked him what it felt like to give something like that its freedom. He replied that he had at last found something that was more fun than sexual intercourse. The young colonel's feelings at the moment of release had to be transcendental, had to be entirely products of that big brain of his, since the plane did not shudder or yaw or suddenly climb or dive when the rocket departed to consummate its love affair. It continued on exactly as before, with the automatic pilot compensating instantly for the sudden change in the plane's weight and aerodynamics. As for the effects of the release visible to Reyes, the rocket was much too high to leave a vapor trail, and its exhaust was clean so that, to Reyes, it was a rod, which quickly shrank to a dot, and then to a speck, and then to nothingness. It vanished so quickly that it was hard to believe that it had ever existed. And that was that. The only residue of the event in the stratosphere had to be in Ray's big brain or nowhere. He was happy. He was humble. He was awed. He was drained. Reyes wasn't crazy to feel that what he had done was analogous to the performance of a male during sexual intercourse. A computer over which he had no control, once he had turned it on, had determined the exact moment of release, and had delivered detailed instructions to the release machinery without any need of advice from him. He didn't know all that much about how the machinery worked anyway. Such knowledge was for specialists. In war, as in love, he was a fearless, happy-go-lucky adventurer. The launching of the missile, in fact, was virtually identical with the role of male animals in the reproductive process. Here was what the colonel could be counted on to do: deliver the goods in an instant. Yes, and that rod, which became a dot, and then a speck, and then nothingness, so quickly was somebody else's responsibility now. All the action from now on would be on the receiving end. He had done his part. He was sweetly sleepy now, and amused and proud. And I worry now about skewing my story, since a few characters in it were genuinely insane, and giving the impression that everybody a million years ago was insane. That was not the case. I repeat, that was not the case. Almost everybody was sane back then, and I gladly award Reyes that widespread encomium. The big problem again wasn't insanity, but that people's brains were much too big and untruthful to be practical. No single human being could claim credit for that rocket, which was going to work so perfectly, It was the collective achievement of all who had ever put their big brains to work on the problem of how to capture and compress the diffuse violence of which nature was capable, and drop it in relatively small packages on their enemies. I myself had had some highly personal experiences with dreams come true of that sort in Vietnam, which is to say, with mortars and hand grenades and artillery. Nature could never have been that predictably destructive in such small spaces without the help of humankind. I have already told my story about the old woman I shot for throwing a hand grenade. There are plenty of others I could tell, but no explosion I saw or heard about in Vietnam could compare with what happened when that Peruvian rocket put the tip of its nose, that part of its body most richly supplied with exposed nerve endings, into that Ecuadorian radar dish. No one is interested in sculpture these days. Who could handle a chisel or a welding torch with their flippers or their mouths? If there were a monument out here in the islands, though, celebrating a key event in the past, that would be a good one. The moment of mating, right before the explosion between that rocket and that radar dish. Into the lava plinth beneath it, these words might be incised, expressing the sentiments of all who had had a hand in the design and manufacture and sale and purchase and launch of the rocket, and of all to whom high explosives were a branch of the entertainment industry. 'Tis a consummation, devoutly to be wished. William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616. 35. 20 minutes before the rocket gave that French kiss to the radar dish, Captain Adolf von Kleist concluded that it was now safe for him to come down from the crow's nest of the Bahia de Darwin. The ship had been picked clean, and had fewer amenities and navigational aids even than had Her Majesty's ship Beagle when that brave little wooden sailboat began her voyage around the world on December 27, 1831. The Beagle had had a compass, at least, and a sextant, and navigators who could imagine with considerable accuracy the position of their ship in the clockwork of the universe, because of their knowledge of the stars. And the Beagle, moreover, had oil lanterns and candles for the nighttime, and hammocks for the seamen, and mattresses and pillows for the officers. Anyone determined to spend the night on the Bahia de Darwin now would have to rest his or her weary head on nude steel, or perhaps do what Hisako Hiraguchi would do when she couldn't keep her eyes open any longer. Hisako would sit on the lid of the toilet off the main saloon and lay her head on her arms, which were folded atop the wash basin in there. I have likened the mob at the hotel to a tidal wave, whose crest swept past the bus, never to return again. I would say that the mob at the waterfront was more like a tornado. Now, that ferocious whirlwind was moving inland in the twilight, and feeding on itself, since its members had themselves become worth robbing, carrying lobsters and wine and electronic gear, and drapes and coat hangers and cigarettes and chairs and rolls of carpeting and towels and bedspreads and on and on. So the captain clambered down from the crow's nest. The rungs bruised his bare and tender feet. He had the ship and the entire waterfront all to himself, as far as he could see. He went to his cabin first, since he was wearing only his undershorts. He hoped that the looters had left him a little something to wear. When he turned on the light switch in there, though, nothing happened, because all the light bulbs were gone. There was electricity anyway, since the ship still had her banks of storage batteries down in the engine room. The thing was, the light bulb thieves had blacked out the engine room before the batteries and generators and starter motors could be stolen. So, in a sense, they had unwittingly done humanity a big favor. Thanks to them, the ship would still run. Without her navigational aids, she was as blind as Selena McIntosh, but she was still the fastest ship in that part of the world, and she could slice water at top speed for 20 days without refueling if necessary, providing nothing went wrong in the pitch-dark engine room. As things would turn out, though, after only 5 days at sea, something would go very much wrong in the pitch-dark engine room. The captain certainly had no plans for putting out to sea as he groped about his cabin for more clothes to hide his nakedness. There wasn't even a handkerchief or a washcloth in there. Thus, he was having his first taste of a textile shortage, which at the moment seemed merely inconvenient, but which would be acute during the 30 years of life still ahead of him. Cloth to protect his skin from sunburn in the daytime and from chills at night simply would not be available anymore. How he and the rest of the first colonists would come to envy Hisako's daughter Akiko for her coat of fur. Everybody but Akiko, until Akiko herself had furry babies, would in the daytime have to wear fragile capes and hats made of feathers tied together with fish guts. Quoth Mandarax to the contrary, "Man is a biped without feathers." Plato, 1427 to 347 BC. The captain remained calm as he searched his cabin. The shower in the head was dripping, and he turned it off tight. That much he could make right anyway. That was how composed he was. As I have already said, his digestive system still had food to process. Even more important to his peace of mind, though, was that nobody was counting on him for anything. Those who had looted the ship almost all had numerous relatives in dire need, who were starting to roll their eyes and pat their bellies and point down their throats like the Kankabono girls. The captain was still in possession of his famous sense of humor, and freer than ever to indulge it. For whose sake was he now to pretend that life was a serious matter? There weren't even rats left on the ship. There had never been rats on the Bahia de Darwin, which was another lucky break for mankind. If rats had come ashore with the first human settlers on Santa Rosalia, there would have been nothing left for the people to eat in 6 months or so. And then, after that, the rats, having eaten what was left of the people and each other, would themselves have died. Quoth Mandarax, "Rats, they fought the dogs and killed the cats, and bit the babies in the cradles, and ate the cheeses out of the vats, and licked the soup from the cook's own ladles, split open the kegs of salted sprats, made nests inside men's Sunday hats, and even spoiled the women's chats by drowning their speaking, with shrieking and squeaking, in 50 different sharps and flats." Robert Browning, 1812 to 1889. The captain's clever fingers, working in the blacked-out head, now encountered what would prove to be half a bottle of cognac sitting atop the tank of his toilet. This was the last bottle of any sort still aboard the ship, and its contents were the last substance to be found from stem to stern and from crow's nest to keel, which a human being could metabolize. In saying that, of course, I exclude the possibility of cannibalism. I ignore the fact that the captain himself was quite edible. And just as the captain's fingers got a firm grip on the bottle's neck in the darkness, something big and strong outside gave the Bahia de Darwin an authoritative bump. Also, there were male voices from the boat deck, one deck below. The thing was, the tugboat crew which had delivered fuel and food to the Colombian freighter San Mateo was now preparing to haul away the Bahia de Darwin's 2 lifeboats. They had cast off the ship's bowline, and the tug was nosing her bow into the estuary, so that the lifeboat on her starboard side could be lowered into the water. So that the ship was now married to the South American mainland by a single line at her stern. Poetically speaking, that stern line is the white nylon umbilical cord of all modern humankind. The captain might as well have been my fellow ghost on the Bahia de Darwin. The men who took our lifeboats never even suspected that there was another soul aboard. All alone again, except for me, he proceeded to get drunk. What could that matter now? The tugboat with the lifeboats following obediently had disappeared upstream. The San Mateo, all lit up like a Christmas tree, and with the radar dish atop her bridge revolving, had disappeared downstream, so that the captain felt free to shout whatever he pleased from the bridge without attracting unfavorable attention. His hands on the ship's wheel, he called into the starlight evening, "Man overboard!" He was speaking of himself. Expecting nothing to happen, he pressed the starter button for the port engine. From the bowels of the ship came the muffled, deep purple rumble of a great diesel engine in perfect health. He pressed the other starter button, giving the gift of life to the engine's identical twin. These dependable, uncomplaining slaves had been born in Columbus, Indiana, not far from Indiana University, where Mary Hepburn had taken her master's degree in zoology. Small world. That the diesels still worked was to the captain simply one more reason to make himself wild and stupid with cognac. He switched off the engines, and it was a good thing that he did. If he had let them run long enough to get really hot, that temperature anomaly might have attracted the electronic attention of a Peruvian fighter bomber in the stratosphere. In Vietnam, we had heat-sensing instruments so sensitive that could actually detect the presence of people, or at least big mammals of some kind, in the night, because their bodies were just a little bit warmer than their surroundings. One time, I called in an artillery barrage on a water buffalo. Usually it was people out there, trying to sneak up on us and kill us if they could. What a life! I would have loved to put down all my weapons and become a fisherman instead. And that was the sort of thing the captain was thinking up there on the bridge. What a life! And so on. It was all very funny, except he didn't feel like laughing. He thought that life had now taken his measure, and found him not worth much of anything, and was now through with him. Little did he know! He went out on the sun deck, which was aft of the bridge and the officers' cabins, his bare feet on bare steel. Now that the sun deck had been stripped of its carpeting, the plugged holes which were supposed to receive the mounts for weapons were plainly visible, even in the starlight. I myself had welded 4 of the plates on the sun deck. Most of my work, and my finest work, however, was deep inside. The captain looked up at the stars, and his big brain told him that his planet was an insignificant speck of dust in the cosmos, and that he was a germ on that speck, and that nothing could matter less than what became of him. That was what those big brains used to do with their excess capacity, blather on like that. To what purpose? You won't catch anybody thinking thoughts like that today. So then he saw a shooting star, a meteorite burning up on the edge of the atmosphere, up where Lieutenant Colonel Reyes, in his spacesuit, had just received word that Peru was officially at war with Ecuador. The shooting star cued the captain's big brain to have him marvel yet again about how unprepared people were for meteorites striking the Earth's surface. And then there was this tremendous explosion out at the airport as the rocket and the radar dish honeymooned. The hotel bus, all painted up outside with the blue-footed boobies and marine iguanas and penguins and flightless cormorants and so on, was at that moment parked in front of a hospital. The captain's brother Siegfried was about to go inside and get help for James Waite, who had lost consciousness. Waite's heart attack had necessitated this detour on the way to the airport, which had surely saved the lives of all on board. The great bubble of the shock wave from that explosion was as dense as bricks. To those on the bus, it seemed that the hospital itself had exploded. The windows and windshield of the bus were blown inward, but turned out to have been shatterproof. They had not turned to shrapnel. Mary and Hisako and Selina and Kazak and poor Waite and the Kankabono girls and the captain's brother were pelted with seeming kernels of white corn instead. This would happen on the Bahia de Darwin as well. The windows would all be blown in, and white kernels would be underfoot everywhere. The hospital, so full of light only moments before, was blacked out now, as was the whole city, and there were cries for help coming from inside. The engine of the bus was still running, thank God, and its headlights illuminated a narrow pathway through the debris up ahead. So Siegfried, becoming more palsied by the second, still managed to drive away from there. What help could he or anybody else on the bus be to the survivors, if any, in the blasted hospital? And the logic of the maze of rubble directed the creeping bus away from the center of the explosion, the airport, and toward the waterfront. The road across the marsh from the edge of the city to the deep-water wharves was in fact almost clear of wreckage. There was so little for the shock wave to knock down out there. Siegfried von Kleist drove to the waterfront because it was the path of least resistance. Only he could see where they were going. The others were still on the floor of the bus. Mary Hepburn had dragged the unconscious James Waite away from the Cancabono girls, so that he was lying flat on his back now, with her lap for a pillow. The big brains of the Cancabonos had shut down entirely, for want of even a wisp of a theory as to what was going on. Hisako Hiraguchi and Selena McIntosh and Kazak were similarly immobilized. And everybody was deaf, since the shockwave had done such violence to the bones in their inner ears, the tiniest bones in their bodies. Nor would any of them recover their sense of hearing entirely. With the exception of the captain, the first colonists on Santa Rosalia would all be slightly deaf, so that a good deal of their conversations would consist in one language or another of, "Eh?" or "Speak up," and so on. This defect, fortunately, was not inheritable. Like Andrew McIntosh and Zenji Hiraguchi, they would never find out what hit them, unless there were answers to questions like that at the far end of the blue tunnel into the afterlife. They would accept the captain's theory that the explosion and another explosion still to come had been the impacts of white-hot boulders from outer space, but not wholeheartedly, since the captain would prove to be laughably mistaken about so many things. The captain's palsied younger brother, his ears ringing, some of his hearing returning, stopped the bus on the wharf near the Bahia de Darwin. He had not expected her to be a haven. He was unsurprised to find her dark and apparently deserted, with her windows blown in, her lifeboats missing, and barely secured to the wharf by a single line at her stern. Her freed bow was some distance from the wharf, so that her gangplank dangled over the water. She had, of course, been looted, like the hotel. The wharf was littered with wrappings and cartons and other trash discarded by the scavengers. Siegfried did not expect to see his brother. He had heard that the captain had left New York, but not that he had actually reached Guayaquil. If the captain was somewhere in Guayaquil, he was very likely dead or injured, or, in any case, in no position to be of much help to anyone. Nobody in Guayaquil at that point in history was in a position to be of much help to anyone else. Quoth Mandarax, "Help yourself, and heaven will help you." Jean de La Fontaine, 1621 to 1695. The most Siegfried hoped to find was a peaceful stopping place in chaos. This he did. There did not seem to be anybody else around. So he got out of the bus to see if he couldn't somehow get the involuntary dancing movements caused by Huntington's chorea under control by doing exercises, jumping jacks and push-ups and deep knee bends and so on. The moon was coming up. And then he saw a human figure rising to its feet on the sun deck of the Bahia de Darwin. It was his brother, but the captain's face was in shadow, so Siegfried did not recognize him. Siegfried had heard whispered stories about the ships being haunted. He believed that he was beholding a ghost. He thought it was me. He thought he was seeing Leon Trout. 36. The captain recognized his brother, though, and he shouted down to him what I might have been tempted to shout had I been a materialized ghost up there. He shouted this: "Welcome! Welcome to the nature cruise of the century!" The captain, still holding on to his bottle, although it was empty now, came down to the main deck at the stern, so that he was nearly on a level with his brother, and Siegfried, because he was so deaf, came as close as he could without falling into the narrow moat between them. The moat was bridged by the stern line, by that white umbilical cord. "I'm deaf," said Siegfried. "Are you deaf too?" "No," said the captain. He had been much farther away than Siegfried from the center of the explosion. He had a nosebleed, though, which he chose to find comical. He bashed his nose when the shockwave knocked him down on the sun deck. The cognac had exacerbated his sense of humor to the point where everything seemed screamingly funny. He thought the exercises Siegfried had done on the wharf were a lampoon of the dancing sickness they both might have inherited from their father. "I liked the imitation of father," he said. The whole conversation was in German, the language of their infancy, the first language they had known. "Addy," said Siegfried, "this isn't funny." "Everything is funny," said the captain. Do you have any medicine? Do you have any food? Do you still have beds? Said Siegfried. The captain replied with a quotation well known to Mandarax. I owe much. I have nothing. I give the rest to the poor. François Rabelais, 1494 to 1553. You're drunk, said Siegfried. Why not? The captain asked. I'm nothing but a clown. The random damage being done to his brain by cognac made him terribly self-centered. He could give no thought to the suffering others must be doing in the dark and blasted city in the distance. You know what my own crewman said to me when I tried to keep him from stealing the compass, Ziggy? No, said Siegfried, and he started to dance again. Out of the way, you clown, said the captain, and he laughed and laughed. He dared to say that to an admiral, Ziggy. I would have had him hanged from the yardarm. If somebody hadn't stolen the yardarm at dawn, if somebody hadn't stolen the dawn. People still get the hiccups, incidentally. They still have no control over whether they do it or not. I often hear them hiccuping, involuntarily closing their glottises and inhaling spasmodically as they lie on the broad white beaches or paddle around the blue lagoons. If anything, people hiccup more now than they did a million years ago. This had less to do with evolution, I think, than with the fact that so many of them gulp down raw fish without chewing them up sufficiently. People. And people still laugh about as much as they ever did, despite their shrunken brains. If a bunch of them are lying around on a beach and one of them farts, everybody else laughs and laughs, just as people would have done a million years ago. 37. The captain went on. Actually, I have been vindicated, Siegfried. I have long said that we should expect to be hit by large meteorites from time to time. That has come to pass. It was the hospital that blew up, said Siegfried. So it had seemed to him. No hospital ever blew up like that, said the captain. And to Siegfried's dismay, he climbed up on the rail and prepared to jump to the wharf. It wasn't all that much of a jump, really, only about 2 meters across the moat, but the captain was very drunk. The captain aviated successfully, crashing to his knees on the wharf. This cured his hiccups. Is there anybody else on the ship? Said Siegfried. Nobody here but us chickens, said the captain. He had no idea that he and Siegfried were responsible for rescuing anybody but each other. Everybody on the bus was still on the floor. Siegfried, incidentally, had entrusted Mary Hepburn with Mandarax in case she had to communicate with Hisako Hiraguchi. Mandarax, as I've said, was useless as an interpreter for the Kankabonos. The captain put his arm around the quaking brothers of Siegfried and said to him, Don't be scared, little brother. We're from a long line of survivors. What's a little shower of meteorites to a Von Kleist? Addy, said Siegfried, is there some other way we can get the ship closer to the dock? He thought the people on the bus might feel a little safer and surely less cramped on shipboard. Fuck this ship. Nothing left on her, said the captain. I think they even stole old Leon. Again, Leon was me. Addy, said Siegfried, there are 10 people on that bus, and one of them is having a heart attack. The captain squinted at the bus. What makes them so invisible? He said. His hiccups were gone again. They're all on the floor, and they're scared to death, said Siegfried. You've got to sober up. I can't look after them. You're going to have to do whatever you can. I'm not in control of my own actions anymore, Addy. Of all the times for it to happen, I have father's disease. Time stopped, as far as the captain was concerned. This was a familiar illusion for him. He could count on experiencing it several times a year, whenever he received news he could not joke about. He knew how to get time going again, which was to deny the bad news. It isn't true, he said. It cannot be. You think I dance for the fun of it? Said Siegfried, and he was involuntarily dancing away from his brother. He approached the captain again, just as involuntarily, saying, My life is over. It probably never should have been lived. At least I never reproduced, so that some poor woman might give birth to yet another monstrosity. I feel so helpless, said the captain, and added wretchedly,
And so goddamn drunk. Jesus, I certainly expected no more responsibilities. I'm so drunk. I can't think. Tell me what to do, Ziggy.
He was too drunk to do much of anything, so he stood by, slack-jawed and goggle-eyed, while Mary Hepburn and Hisako and Siegfried, whenever poor Siegfried could stop dancing, hauled the stern of the ship right up to the wharf with the bus, and then parked the bus under the stern so that it could be used as a ladder up to the lowest deck of the ship, which would have been unreachable otherwise. And oh, yes, you could say, wasn't that ingenious of them? And they could never have done that if they hadn't had great big brains. And you can bet nobody today could figure out how to do stuff like that, and so on. Then again, those people wouldn't have had to behave so resourcefully, wouldn't have been in such complicated difficulties if the planet hadn't been made virtually uninhabitable by the creations and activities of other people's great big brains. Quoth Mandarax, "What's lost upon the roundabouts, we pulls up on the swings." Patrick Reginald Chalmers, 1872 to 1942. People expected the most trouble to come from the unconscious James Waite. Actually, the most trouble would come from the captain, who was too drunk to be trusted as a link in the human chain, who could only sit on the back seat of the bus and rue how drunk he was. His hiccups had returned. Here is how they got James Waite up on the ship. There was enough extra stern line on the wharf for Mary Hepburn to make a harness for him at the free end of the line. This was all her idea, the harness. She was, after all, an experienced mountaineer. They laid him beside the bus with the harness on. Then she and Hisako and Siegfried got on the roof and hauled him up as gently as possible. And then the three of them got him over the rail and onto the main deck. They would later move him up to the sun deck, where he would regain consciousness briefly, long enough for him and Mary Hepburn to become man and wife. Siegfried then came back down to tell the captain that it was his turn to get aboard. The captain, knowing he was going to make a fool of himself while trying to reach the roof, played for time. Jumping while drunk was easy. Climbing anything the least bit complicated was something else again. Why so many of us a million years ago purposely knocked out major chunks of our brains with alcohol from time to time remains an interesting mystery. It may be that we were trying to give evolution a shove in the right direction, in the direction of smaller brains. So the captain, playing for time and trying to sound judicious and respectable, although he could scarcely stand up, said to his brother, "I'm not so sure that man was well enough to be moved." Siegfried was out of patience with him. He said, "That's too damn bad, isn't it? Because we just moved the poor bastard anyway. Maybe we should have called a helicopter instead and had him flown to the bridal suite at the Waldorf Astoria." And those would be the last words the brothers von Kleist would ever exchange, except for hup and alley-oop and whoops and so on, as the captain tried and failed to get up on the roof of the bus again and again. But he finally did get up, although thoroughly humiliated. He was at least able to go from the roof to the ship without further assistance, and then Siegfried told Mary to get on the ship with the rest of them, and to do what she could for Waite, whom they believed to be Willard Fleming. She did as she was told, thinking it was a matter of manly pride for him to climb to the roof without assistance. That left Siegfried all alone on the wharf, looking up at the rest of them, and they expected him to join them, but that was not meant to be. He sat down in the driver's seat instead. Despite his limbs jerking this way and that, he started up the engine. His plan was to head back for the city at top speed and to kill himself by smashing into something. Before he could put the bus in gear, he was stunned by the shockwave from yet another tremendous explosion. This one wasn't in or near the city. This one was downstream and out in the virtually uninhabited marsh somewhere. 38. The second explosion was like the first one. A rocket had mated with a radar dish. The dish in this instance was atop the little Colombian freighter, the San Mateo. The Peruvian pilot who gave the rocket the spark of life, Ricardo Cortez, imagined that he had caused it to fall in love with the radar dish of the Bahia de Darwin, who no longer had radar and so, as far as that particular sort of rocket was concerned, was without sex appeal. Major Cortez had made what was called, 1,000,000 years ago, an honest mistake. And let it be said, too, that Peru would never have ordered an attack on the Bahia de Darwin if the nature cruise of the century had gone ahead as planned, with a shipload of celebrities. Peru would not have been that insensitive to world opinion, but the cancellation of the cruise made the ship an entirely different kettle of fish, so to speak. A potential troop carrier manned, any reasonable person might assume, by persons who were effectively begging to be blown up or napalmed or machine-gunned or whatever, which is to say, naval personnel. So these Colombianos were out there in the marsh in the moonlight, headed for the open ocean and home, eating the first decent meal they had had in a week, and imagining that their radar dish was watching over them like a revolving Virgin Mary. She would never allow any harm to come to them. Little did they know. What they were eating, incidentally, was an old dairy cow who wasn't able to give all that much milk anymore. That was what was under the tarpaulin on the lighter which had provisioned the San Mateo, that dairy cow, still very much alive. And she had been hoisted aboard on the side away from the waterfront so that people ashore couldn't see her. There were people ashore desperate enough to kill for her. She was one hell of a lot of protein to be leaving Ecuador. It was interesting to see how they hoisted her. They didn't use a sling or a cargo net. They made a rope crown for her, wrapped around and around her horns. They embedded the steel hook at the end of the cable of the crane in the tangled crown, and then the crane operator above reeled in the cable so that the cow was soon dangling in thin air, in an upright position for the first time in her life, with her hind legs splayed, her udder exposed, and with her front legs thrust out horizontally, so that she had the general configuration of a kangaroo. The evolutionary process which had produced this huge mammal had never anticipated that she might be in such a position, with the weight of her entire body depending from her neck. Her neck as she dangled was coming to resemble that of a blue-footed booby, or swan, or flightless cormorant. To certain sorts of big brains back in those days, her experience with aviation might have been something to laugh about. She was anything but graceful. And when she was set down on the deck of the San Mateo, she was so severely injured that she could no longer stand. But that was to be expected, and perfectly acceptable. Long experience had shown sailors that cattle so treated could go on living for a week or more, would keep their own meat from rotting until it was time for them to be eaten. What had been done to that dairy cow was a shorter version of what used to be done to the great land tortoises back in the days of sailing ships. In either case, there was no need for refrigeration. The happy Colombianos were chewing and swallowing some of that poor cow's meat when they were blown to bits by the latest advance in the evolution of high explosives, which was called dagonite. Dagonite was the son, so to speak, of a considerably weaker explosive made by the same company, and called Glaco. Glaco begat dagonite, so to speak, and both were descendants of Greek fire, and gunpowder, and dynamite, and cordite, and TNT. So it might be said that the Colombianos had treated the cow abominably, but that retribution had been swift and terrible, thanks largely to the big-brained inventors of dagonite. In view of how badly the Colombianos had treated the cow, Major Ricardo Cortez, flying faster than sound, might be seen as a virtuous knight in the days of yore. And he felt that way about himself, too, although he knew nothing about the cow or what his rocket had hit. He radioed back to his superiors that the Bahia de Darwin was destroyed. He asked that his best friend, Lieutenant Colonel Reyes, who was back on the ground and who had turned a rocket loose on the airport that afternoon, be given this message in Spanish. It is true. Reyes would understand that he was agreeing that letting the rocket go had been as elating as sexual intercourse, and he would never find out that he had not hit the Bahia de Darwin, and the friends and relatives of the Colombianos who were blown to Hamburger in the estuary would never learn what became of them. The rocket which hit the airport was surely a lot more effective in Darwinian terms than the one that hit the San Mateo. It killed thousands of people and birds and dogs and cats and rats and mice and so on, who would otherwise have reproduced their own kind. The blast in the marsh killed only the 14 crewmen and about 500 rats on the ship, and a few hundred birds, and some crabs and fish and so on. Mainly, though, it was an ineffectual assault on the very bottom of the food chain, the billions upon billions of microorganisms who, along with their own excrement and the corpses of their ancestors, comprised the muck of the marsh. The explosion didn't bother them much, since they weren't all that sensitive to sudden starts and stops. They could never have committed suicide in the manner as Siegfried von Kleist at the wheel of the bus intended to commit suicide, with a sudden stop. They were simply moved suddenly from one neighborhood to another one. They flew through the air, bringing a lot of the old neighborhood with them, and then came splattering down. Many of them even experienced great prosperity as the result of the explosion, feasting on what was left of the cow and the rats and the crew and other higher life forms. Quoth Mandarax, "It is wonderful to see with how little nature will be satisfied." Michel Iquem de Montaigne, 1533 to 1592. The detonation of Dagonite, son of Glauco, direct descendant of noble Dynamite, caused a tidal wave in the estuary, which was 6 meters high when it swept the bus off the wharf at the Guayaquil waterfront and drowned Siegfried von Kleist, who wanted to die anyway. More importantly, it snapped the white nylon umbilical cord which tied the future of humankind to the mainland. The wave carried the Bahia de Darwin a kilometer upstream, and then left her gently aground on a mudbank in the shallows there. She was illuminated not only by moonlight, but by sick, jazzy fires breaking out all over Guayaquil. The captain arrived on the bridge. He started the twin diesel engines in the darkness far below. He engaged her twin propellers, and the ship slid off the mudbank. She was free. The captain steered downstream toward open ocean. Quoth Mandarax, "The ship, a fragment detached from the earth, went on lonely and swift, like a small planet." Joseph Conrad, 1857 to 1924. And the Bahia de Darwin wasn't just any ship. As far as humanity was concerned, she was the new Noah's Ark.